Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Thursday, September 26th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, in 1948, a plane carrying Mexican farm workers crashed just outside of Coalinga. All on board were killed. At the time, a local paper referred to the workers as, quote, deportees.
And to add insult to injury, the Mexican passengers' remains were pushed into an unmarked mass grave right there in Fresno, and they were never heard from again. Their families were never notified.
We'll hear from the author who helped find those passengers' names and also connected with their families in just a few minutes. But first, today's headlines. Religious leaders and criminal justice advocates have embarked on a pilgrimage. They're calling for an end to immigrant detention centers across California. KVPR's Joshua Yeager was at the caravan's first stop in Kern County on Wednesday.
Dozens gathered outside the Golden State Annex facility in McFarland. The ICE detention center is where more than 70 incarcerated people are currently on a hunger strike, protesting unpaid labor and alleged mistreatment. Jose Ruben Hernandez spent 16 months here and at a sister facility in Bakersfield.
We're subjected to have to clean for nothing, hard labor for no pay.
Now Hernandez is helping lead a pilgrimage across the state, calling for the centers to close and the release of detainees.
The pain is real.
About 50 people showed up to the first of several protests. The pilgrimage will move south to other ICE facilities, ending Sunday in San Diego. For KVPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager in McFarland.
Former U.S. Congressman TJ Cox is still awaiting his fate from charges that accuse him of financial crimes. In a federal court in Fresno on Wednesday, Cox was widely expected to accept a plea deal, but instead asked for a trial date. Mark Coleman is Cox's attorney. Speaking to reporters, he said Cox is considering all of his options and is not ready to accept a plea deal offered by federal prosecutors.
We just want to make sure the agreement that we enter into is a fair agreement.
In 2022, the former congressman was charged with 28 counts of wire fraud and money laundering. His plea hearing has been postponed multiple times this year. The next hearing is scheduled for mid-December. Voter turnout in the Central Valley is consistently the lowest in the state. As KVPR's Rachel Livenall reports, the region's voting habits largely mirror national trends.
Political science professor Lisa Bryan says the roots of the valley's low voter turnout may lie in the region's immigrant background and a lack of awareness about voting for those who are eligible.
I'll talk to my students about voting and they'll say, my parents don't vote. I didn't really ever grow up talking about voting or thinking about voting. And so I think that really affects our region.
She spoke at a webinar discussing nationwide voter turnout trends. Nationwide, trends show the less educated and the younger the voter is, the less likely they are to reach a ballot box. In the Valley, less than 1 in 5 people hold at least a bachelor's degree in counties like Kern and Merced. This data is reflective of the Valley's turnout results. For KVPR News, I'm Rachel Livenall.
The Kern County Fair is wrapping up this week, and attendees tonight will get a treat, a performance from an award-winning 7-year-old mariachi singer. Alessandra Gutierrez of Bakersfield recently won a national mariachi competition in the elementary school division. Here she is at the National Mariachi Youth Vocalist Competition in Texas earlier this year. Gutierrez's parents told news outlets that she discovered her voice on a trip to Guadalajara at the age of 6, when she stood on a chair and sang with the mariachi band at a local restaurant.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from the members of KVPR. Join at $8 or more per month and access ad-free NPR podcasts through NPR+. Give now at kvpr.org/donate.
And now to our main story. It was January 28, 1948, when a DC-3 plane carrying mostly Mexican farm laborers crashed in the Los Gatos Canyon, about 20 miles west of Coalinga. The crash killed everyone on board. Some of the passengers were being returned to Mexico because their farm working contracts had ended, while others were undocumented immigrants being deported. Initial reports of the crash identified only the names of the plane's crew members and listed the passengers just as unnamed deportees. Tim Z. Hernandez has written 2 books on the subject, including his newly released memoir, They Call You Back. His first book identified all the victims of the 1948 crash and chronicled the lives of some of their descendants. This Saturday, Tim, along with the R.C. Baker Museum and Coalinga College, will unveil a memorial at the crash site. Tim Z. Hernandez joins me now. Thanks for taking the time to join us, Tim.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us more about the crash, how it happened, and what the aftermath of it was.
Basically, the United States government they were deporting 28 Mexican bracero workers. They were here as part of the bracero program back then in the 1940s. But their contract had expired and they were being sent back to Mexico. The plane was filled with 28 of those passengers and 4 American crew members. And the plane left Oakland, California, and it was supposed to transport them to the San Diego border. An hour after it took off, it crashed down there in Fresno County in Los Gatos Canyon in the town of Coalinga, in the foothills above the town of Coalinga. Killed everyone aboard. The newspapers, as you mentioned, only wrote the names of the 4 American crew members, but omitted the names of the Mexican passengers, referred to them only as deportees. And to add insult to injury, the Mexican passengers' remains were pushed into an unmarked mass grave right there in Fresno, and they were never heard from again. Their families were never notified, and they existed anonymously there in that grave, in that burial ground, for 7 decades, basically, until I discovered that's where they were, and I learned of the story, and I was living in Fresno at that precise time, and I just decided to find out who those passengers were, and here I am 14 years later, still writing about them.
So what possessed you to find these individuals' names?
Well, curiosity is always what pulls me into any good story. And at the time, I was working for the California Humanities, to be perfectly honest. And my mind was sort of on that type of idea already, these lost or untold narratives. And so when I heard of that, I just went over, found where they were buried. And standing at an unmarked mass grave has a kind of a gravity. It just pulls you into the mystery. And I felt like there's something wrong here, gravely wrong. And also, I might have the resources to find some answers. And that was really it. It wasn't to write books. It was just a very kind of like, I might be able to help this situation out and find out who they are. That's how it began.
Tell us why you chose the title for your book, your first book, All They Will Call You.
It comes from Woody Guthrie's lyrics in the song Deportee, Plane Wreck at Los Gatos. He says, all they will call you will be deportees. And that sort of was a haunting refrain for me as I went about the research. I just kept thinking, all they will call you, like, what is it that they're calling these folks? And what are all the names that we have for them? And who are they really? At the end of the day, what are their names? And also because it was resonating with me in my own familial experiences, things I've had happen in my family as well. And I think that was why the mystery kept calling and speaking to me.
What did your research actually look like? How did you find these people's names and their family members? I mean, that just sounds so laborious. And how did you keep with that for years?
It's crazy because I want to say to the listeners out there that I wasn't schooled in investigative journalism. It's not my background, investigations of any kind. I'm a poet, really. But I just have learned to follow my own instincts and curiosities since I was a child. And also, as my new book points out, I was pretty familiar with searching for people from an early age. My family and I would often search for family members who were in lost graves and unmarked graves since I was a kid. And so I think all those things are sort of inform a young person growing up, and they're dormant for years. And then one day suddenly it just makes sense. And that was my situation. And so I just sort of really naively, to be honest, just kind of started knocking on doors. First with the cemetery, do you have the names? Next thing I know, I was at the Hall of Records there in Fresno. Do you have these names? And it was like on and on, looking and looking until I found the first family, which is located there in Fresno, the Ramirez family. They had the single newspaper to this day that has all of their names of the passengers. And that's the one newspaper that I have used as the clue to find all of these families since then.
So in your new book, you dive a little deeper into this topic, and it kind of intersects with your own personal life. As you mentioned, your family looking for family members as well. That book is titled They Call You Back. Describe the connection, if you would, between the books.
Yeah. because I thought when I wrote and published All They Will Call You, I thought I was done. That book came out in 2017, and I was like, okay. At that point, I found 5 of the families. I wrote about them, traveled through Mexico, traveled all over this country searching. I'm done with this subject. I've done all I can. I'm moving on. But as the book went out into the world, families began to find me, and families continued to call me and saying, I'm a relative. Years later, it just kept happening. And I finally kind of just thought, well, the story's not done with me, maybe, And so as I listened, I started to actually have to ask myself questions that came up from the families, like questions about generational grief, the grief we carry through generations, the trauma, and what it inspires and what it creates down the road for our lineages, right? For their descendants. What happened? I learned that some of the families grieved so deeply, their grief was so deeply from that loss that it affected their great-grandchildren to this day, who are teachers, educators. They're in California, here in the United States, politicians in some cases. Like, they're just folks who we see every day here, and how that one plane crash affected them. And it forced me to ask myself those same questions about my life and my family. So, and They Call You Back, the difference is that They Call You Back is about my searching for these families and what happened behind the scenes there, whereas All They Will Call You stays in the 1940s and is about those families at that time.
Tim Z. Hernandez, author of the new book, They Call You Back. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate all that you do there.
This Saturday, Tim, along with the R.C. Baker Museum and Coalinga College, will unveil a memorial for the crash victims at the site where it happened, as well as hold a book launch at the Visalia Barnes & Noble. And that does it for today. Thank you for listening. If you have feedback or a story idea, we would love to hear from you. Just email podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.